Coming up next on the Delaware Way, after a series of budget crises, now we have a surplus. So what does the state do with it? We'll find out from the budget director. This is the Delaware Way. Welcome to the Delaware Way. I'm Larry Menti. As you know, every year it seems like Delaware is dealing with a state budget crisis. This year may be an exception. Here to talk about that is Mike Jackson, who is the state budget director. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Larry.
So you have a surplus.
We do. Our most recent revenue estimates that were in September of this fiscal year have identified a continued upward trend in our revenue forecast. And the General Assembly, at the urging of the governor, when we finished the fiscal year 2019 budget, actually did not spend all of the money that we could have. We only appropriated about 97% of the available resources that we could spend. By Constitution, we can do 98% of it, and that generated a savings of approximately $47 million that continues to, for lack of a better way of saying it, rest in the state's bank accounts.
And so $47 million, I've had many politicians here, many people in the Senate and in the Assembly who come in here and every one of them says, you know, we have to put aside money. Mm-hmm. We need money just in case there's an emergency and we don't have it. Is that what this is for now? That
is what it is for. So the state itself, its financial structure does set aside what is called a rainy day fund. That is a fund that is about $240 million worth of resources that are available in case of extreme emergencies. It does require a vote of the General Assembly to be able to access. In the state's history, it hasn't accessed it. It's been available since the late 70s when the state instituted a new financial architecture, and what the General Assembly as well as the governor is urging is to be able to set aside funds that we can readily use in case that there is a revenue shortfall during any given fiscal year or in a year in which we're planning for.
Well, if you have budget crisis, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I keep reading the headlines every year. We are in a budget crisis. We're in a budget crisis. These places, things have to be cut. We're not going to be giving money to the schools as much as we did in the past. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be giving money to charities as much as we did in the past. If that was happening, why didn't you tap into the fund since the 1970s?
Well, it comes down to what we define as a crisis. I think the rainy day fund is something that is set aside in case we have, you know, a natural disaster, in case we have an extreme emergency within the state. I think there's been a belief within the General Assembly as well as prior administrations that we should be able to manage our expenses first before we look to tap into our reserves.
What is the reason for the surplus? Is it because the national economy is doing so well?
I think it's the combination of the national economy, but also we have low unemployment. Here in the state of Delaware, we have strong wage growth that's been occurring, and it's a recognition of really those two factors. And our personal income taxes, at least a longer-term forecast, has growth at approximately 5% within our revenue.
As I talked about a second ago, there were several local and state agencies, including schools, and there was a lot of agencies that depend on state funding that have been cut in the past. Since you have this surplus, have they seen or will they see some of that money come back to them?
So some of the organizations already have. We do have a piece of our appropriations process that supports fire companies, that supports nonprofit organizations, that supports senior centers, that supports other organizations such as the Veterans for Foreign Wars. In the fiscal year 2018 budget process, we had faced a $400 million structural deficit in our budget. That was solved with approximately half of revenue increases, and approximately half of it was through expenditure cuts. A portion of those cuts affected all of the organizations I had just mentioned by about 20%. Meaning that they had their budgets reduced by 20%. Conversely, this year, they have had that funding restored in the fiscal year 2019 budget. So obviously there's organizations that wish to have their funding restored from several years ago. However, we continue to be focused on trying to manage the budget, not just for the year in which we're planning for it, but also in
It's interesting, though, that you have this surplus, and it's because of the lower economy and more people that are paying into the system now, and an increase in wages, and they pay more. That it's so connected to the national economy. So when there's a downturn in the national economy, some of the surplus could go away.
Some of the surplus could go away, which is why it is so important. And I think you've heard the governor say this in the past, which is how we spend our money makes all the difference in the world as we move forward. The current year budget, you had alluded to this earlier, and I had as well, which we didn't spend all the money. We set some of it aside for the future, but the current year budget also only grew the operating budget at just under 4%. The operating budget, with the amount of resources were available, could have grown as high as 10%. What the General Assembly did at the urging of the governor was to make a series of one-time investments rather than build those additional resources into the operating budget, which would have been unsustainable. So as we're planning into fiscal year 2020, we are in that process right now, where agencies are going to submit their budget requests towards the end of next week. We'll have our November public hearings where agencies will be able to share priorities as well as priorities with the governor. Our focus is on continued budget sustainability.
After crisis after crisis after crisis, it's good to be the budget director this year.
I think it's good to be the budget director every year, but I think one of the most satisfying pieces of the budget process this past year was, I think, some of the lessons learned from the past. You have a General Assembly that is focused on the future. You have a governor that is focused on the future. You have a fiscal plan for the year in which we're in that saves money, makes a series of one-time investments, and keeps the operating budget at minimal growth. And the goal is how do we continue to make those level of investments in a sustainable way, not just for the year in which we're planning for, but the out years as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming in. It was great to talk to you.
I appreciate it, Larry.
Mike Jackson is the state budget director. When we come back, dealing with mental health issues and the opioid crisis in the state, we'll talk to the deputy director of the Mental Health Association when the Delaware Way continues right after this.